Number 1. Letecia Stauch, the stepmother who crossed a continent to hide what she had done. On the morning of January 27, 2020, in the city of Colorado Springs, Colorado, 11-year-old Gannon Stauch was last seen alive inside the home he shared with his stepmother, Letecia Stauch. His father, Eugene Al Stauch, was away on a National Guard deployment at the time, leaving Letecia as the sole adult responsible for Gannon and his younger sister Lena. By the afternoon of that same day, Letecia had contacted Al Stauch to tell him that Gannon had gone to a neighbor's house and had not returned. Al immediately reported his son missing, and law enforcement launched what would become one of the most followed missing child searches in Colorado's recent history. What investigators did not yet know was that Gannon Stauch was already gone, and that the woman who had reported him missing was the same person responsible for his disappearance. Letecia Stauch was born Letecia Hardin, and by the time she entered Gannon's life through her marriage to Al Stauch, she had already lived through a great deal of difficulty and upheaval. Those who knew her described a woman capable of great warmth in public, but whose private behavior toward her stepchildren told a different story. Prosecutors would later argue that Letecia had grown deeply resentful of her role within the Stauch household, that she felt burdened by the responsibility of caring for Al's children, and that she harbored a particular hostility toward Gannon specifically. Evidence gathered during the investigation suggested that in the weeks and months before January 2020, Letecia had grown increasingly frustrated and had made statements to others that revealed the depth of her animosity toward the boy. Prosecutors argued that her motive was rooted in a desire to harm Al Stauch through his children, to punish him for what she perceived as emotional and marital failures, and to free herself from a domestic situation she had come to despise. In the days immediately following Gannon's disappearance, Letecia participated in media interviews and made several public appeals for information about her missing stepson. She appeared on local news broadcasts, spoke emotionally about how much she loved Gannon, and presented herself as a devastated family member, desperate for answers. These appearances would later be viewed through an entirely different lens once investigators began to unravel the truth of what had occurred inside that Colorado Springs home. Law enforcement were methodical in their approach from the very beginning. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from around the neighborhood, examined cell phone records, and began speaking with neighbors, friends, and family members. What they discovered through that process was a series of inconsistencies in Letecia's account of events that deepened their suspicion and redirected their investigation toward the woman who was standing before cameras claiming innocence. Cell phone data proved to be among the most important tools investigators used in building their understanding of what had actually happened. Records showed that Letecia's phone had traveled from Colorado to Florida in the days following Gannon's disappearance, a journey she had not disclosed and had no credible explanation for. On March 17, 2020, the Pensacola Police Department in Florida discovered Gannon Stauch's remains inside a suitcase that had been left near a bridge over a waterway that flows toward the Gulf of Mexico. The discovery was both devastating and clarifying for investigators. It confirmed what many had come to fear about the boy's fate, and it provided a critical geographic anchor that tied directly to Letecia's phone data. Letecia Stauch was arrested in Savannah, Georgia, on March 2, 2020, just weeks after Gannon had been reported missing and before his remains had even been found. The charges against her were severe, including first-degree murder, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. The investigation that followed the arrest was extensive. Law enforcement worked to reconstruct a precise timeline of events, identifying the locations where Letecia had traveled with a rented vehicle in the days following Gannon's death. Investigators examined the rental records, reviewed footage from hotels and roadside cameras, and spoke with individuals Letecia had contacted during that cross-country journey. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had acted with deliberate calculation in the aftermath of what she had done, methodically attempting to conceal the truth and distance herself from responsibility. The evidence collected was substantial, and prosecutors expressed confidence well before trial that they had built a case that would hold up under the most rigorous legal scrutiny. Letecia Stauch went to trial in El Paso County, Colorado, beginning in the spring of 2023, more than 3 years after Gannon's death. The trial itself lasted approximately 5 weeks and drew national attention. The prosecution's case rested on extensive physical evidence, digital records, witness testimony, and the geographic trail Letecia had left across several states. Prosecutors argued that Letecia had carried out the act that ended Gannon's life out of resentment and a desire to harm his father, that she had then loaded Gannon's remains into a suitcase placed in the back of a rented van, and that she had driven across the country before disposing of the suitcase from a bridge in Florida. They argued further that she had then attempted to cover her tracks by returning to Colorado and participating in the very search for the child she had already harmed. The defense pursued a strategy centered on mental illness, arguing that Letecia had suffered a catastrophic psychological episode at the time of Gannon's death, what her attorneys described as a major psychotic break brought on by years of trauma stemming from abuse she had endured during her own childhood. Defense attorneys presented the theory that Letecia had been severely and repeatedly abused as a child, that this had left her with deep psychological wounds, and that those wounds had ultimately produced a dissociative identity disorder that was responsible for what had occurred on January 27, 2020. They argued that she had not been legally sane at the time and therefore should not be held criminally responsible in the traditional sense. Expert witnesses called by the defense testified about the complexity of trauma-induced psychological conditions and the ways in which extreme dissociation can alter a person's perception of reality. The prosecution responded by calling their own mental health experts, who had evaluated Letecia extensively during her time in custody. Those evaluators concluded that, while Letecia did have a personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic features, she had been legally sane on the day Gannon died. They testified that she was aware of what she was doing, that she had the capacity to understand the nature of her actions, and that her subsequent behavior, cleaning the scene, loading Gannon's remains into a suitcase, driving to Florida, returning to Colorado, and then giving media interviews, demonstrated not only awareness, but a calculated effort to avoid detection. The jury heard from dozens of witnesses across the 5-week trial, examined hundreds of pieces of evidence, and deliberated for approximately 8 hours before returning their verdict. On May 8, 2023, the jury found Letecia Stauch guilty on all 4 counts: first-degree murder after deliberation, first-degree murder of a child by a person in a position of trust, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. Letecia showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. She sat between her attorneys at the defense table and gave no outward sign of emotion as each count was announced. Members of Gannon's family, who had waited more than 3 years for that moment, delivered impact statements at sentencing that the judge later described as among the most heartbreaking he had ever heard. Al Stauch requested that the court strip Letecia of his family's surname. The judge granted that request symbolically, in spirit, if not in legal terms. On May 9, 2023, District Judge Gregory Werner sentenced Letecia Stauch to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the 2 murder counts, plus additional terms of 13.5 years for the evidence tampering charges. In delivering the sentence, Judge Werner stated that the facts of the case were the most horrific he had ever encountered in his career on the bench, and that Letecia's conduct deserved the maximum punishment the law allowed. He also criticized the insanity defense as a disservice to those who genuinely suffer from mental illness. For a brief period following sentencing, it appeared that the case had reached its conclusion. However, on April 2, 2026, the Colorado Court of Appeals overturned Letecia Stauch's conviction. The appellate court found that one of the jurors who served during the trial had been impliedly biased under Colorado law, due to being within 3 degrees of separation from the state's attorneys. The court determined that this connection, which had not been fully disclosed or addressed during jury selection, constituted a violation of Letecia's right to a fair trial before an impartial jury. The reversal of the conviction did not represent a finding of innocence, nor did it mean that the evidence against Letecia had been deemed insufficient. It was a procedural ruling based on the composition of the jury, and it means that as of the time of this video, a retrial is anticipated. The case of Gannon Stauch, an 11-year-old boy who loved video games, spent time with friends, and had his entire future ahead of him, remains one of the most closely watched true crime cases of the 2020s. His father and biological mother, as well as the broader community in Colorado Springs, continue to live with the impact of his loss. The story of Gannon Stauch prompted widespread discussion about child safety, the vetting of step-parents, and the adequacy of communication between families, schools, and social services. Gannon had been a student in the local school system, had friends, and had a presence in the community that made his sudden disappearance all the more conspicuous. The fact that nearly 2 months passed between his disappearance and the discovery of his remains, and that during much of that time Letecia had been treated as a grieving family member rather than a suspect, led many observers to examine the protocols law enforcement uses when a child goes missing and the primary caregiver becomes the most likely person of interest. The case also raised difficult questions about how courts balance mental illness defenses against the weight of physical and behavioral evidence that points toward deliberate action rather than a psychotic episode divorced from reality. For the families and communities affected by cases like this one, the legal process rarely feels complete, even when convictions are secured. When those convictions are subsequently overturned on procedural grounds, as occurred here, the sense of incompleteness deepens further. The prospect of a retrial means that Gannon's family will be required to re-engage with the most painful chapter of their lives through another round of courtroom proceedings, testimony, and public scrutiny. Whatever the ultimate legal outcome, the facts of what happened to Gannon Stauch on January 27, 2020, an 11-year-old child left in the care of a woman who harbored resentment toward him and who prosecutors argued viewed him as an obstacle, stand as a reminder of how profoundly children depend on the adults placed in positions of authority over them, and how catastrophic the consequences can be when those adults fail in the most fundamental way imaginable. Number 2. Elisa Baker, the stepmother who tried to erase every trace of Zara. Zara Claire Baker was born on May 10, 2000, in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, Australia, and from the very beginning of her life, she demonstrated a resilience that would later come to define how the world remembered her. At the age of 5, Zara was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, an aggressive form of bone cancer that required the surgical removal of her left leg below the knee, the removal of part of her right lung, and treatment that resulted in significant hearing loss in both ears. By the time she was old enough to begin navigating the world as a child with a prosthetic limb and hearing aids, Zara had already faced more hardship than most people encounter in a lifetime. Those who knew her during her years in Australia described a cheerful, freckle-faced girl who adapted to her circumstances with extraordinary spirit and who captured the hearts of everyone around her. In 2008, Zara's father, Adam Baker, relocated from Australia to Hickory, North Carolina, in the United States, bringing Zara with him. Adam had entered into a relationship with Elisa Annette Baker, a North Carolina woman who would become Zara's stepmother. Those who knew Elisa during her earlier years described her as someone who had become increasingly withdrawn from society over the years, deeply immersed in online communities where she constructed alternate identities and elaborate personal narratives. She had largely detached herself from conventional social structures, and those who encountered her noted a pattern of manipulation and dishonesty that had grown more pronounced over time. The picture that investigators would later piece together suggested that Elisa and Adam's home in Hickory was not a stable or nurturing environment for Zara, but the full extent of what Zara was enduring behind closed doors was not known to authorities at the time. On the morning of October 9, 2010, Adam Baker called 911 to report that his 10-year-old daughter was missing from the family's home on 21st Avenue Northwest in Hickory. When police responded, Adam initially suggested that a ransom note left on one of the family's vehicles indicated that Zara had been taken by unknown individuals in a case of mistaken identity. The note claimed that the kidnappers had intended to take a different child. Law enforcement were immediately skeptical. The explanation was implausible on its face, and the circumstances surrounding the note's discovery raised serious questions. An Amber Alert was issued for Zara, and within hours, dozens of officers, volunteers, and search teams were deployed throughout the Hickory area. The case attracted national and international attention almost instantly, driven in part by the deeply sympathetic profile of the child at its center, a young cancer survivor, an amputee, a girl who used hearing aids and a prosthetic limb, and who would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who encountered her. As the search intensified, investigators turned their attention toward the people closest to Zara. Cell phone records proved to be critical. Analysis of Elisa Baker's cell phone data showed that her phone had been in areas where human remains would later be discovered, areas that Adam Baker's phone records placed him away from at the relevant times, as he had been at work near the city of Conover during the periods in question. Elisa Baker was arrested on October 10, 2010, though initially on charges unrelated to Zara's disappearance, including writing bad checks and failing to return property. However, investigators made clear that she was the central focus of the homicide investigation. Elisa subsequently took a polygraph examination and was asked direct questions about whether she had harmed Zara or knew what had happened to her. Over the weeks and months that followed, searchers working across the greater Hickory area made a series of devastating discoveries. Portions of Zara's remains were found at multiple locations in the surrounding region of western North Carolina, and authorities were eventually able to confirm through forensic analysis that the remains belonged to the missing girl. A skull belonging to Zara was located in a separate search in 2012, again in the Hickory area. The state medical examiner's office classified Zara's manner of death as undetermined homicidal violence, reflecting the difficulty of establishing a precise cause of death from the physical evidence that had been recovered. What was not in doubt was that Zara Baker had been killed, that her remains had been deliberately distributed across multiple locations in an attempt to prevent discovery and identification, and that the person responsible was the woman who had been living in the same home as Zara and had signed her name on the ransom note. In October 2011, a Catawba County grand jury indicted Elisa Baker on a charge of second-degree murder in connection with Zara's death. The indictment also incorporated a range of other charges, including obstruction of justice, based on Elisa's admitted role in writing the false ransom note, as well as bigamy, identity theft, and obtaining property by false pretenses. Investigators had determined that Elisa had married Adam Baker in Australia before she had legally divorced a previous husband, rendering the marriage technically bigamous. The weight of the evidence and the totality of the charges against her left Elisa in an extraordinarily weak legal position. On September 15, 2011, Elisa Baker entered a courtroom wearing a bright pink jail jumpsuit and stood before Judge Timothy Kincaid. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Zara Baker. As part of the plea agreement, she also admitted to planting the false ransom note on the family's vehicle in an attempt to mislead investigators and deflect suspicion away from herself. The guilty plea spared the court a lengthy trial and allowed the broader resolution of all charges against her. During the sentencing hearing that followed, witnesses spoke about the impact of Zara's death on the broader community, including friends, family members, and the many people across Australia and the United States who had followed the case. Zara's father, Adam, who himself faced scrutiny during the investigation but was ultimately not charged with the murder, told Elisa during proceedings that she had filled Zara's life with lies. Judge Kincaid sentenced Elisa Baker to a minimum of 14 years and 9 months and a maximum of 18 years and 6 months in prison for Zara's murder, with additional time incorporated for the obstruction, bigamy, identity theft, and related charges. The sentence was criticized by some as too lenient, given the nature of the crime against a 10-year-old child who was already living with extraordinary physical challenges. Advocates for child victims expressed frustration with what they viewed as a disconnect between the gravity of the offense and the time Elisa would ultimately serve. Their concerns proved well-founded. Elisa Baker completed the North Carolina portion of her sentence and was released on parole from state custody on July 2, 2025, approximately 14.5 years after Zara's disappearance. She did not walk free, however. Upon the conclusion of her state sentence, she was transferred directly into federal custody to begin serving an 8-year federal prison sentence she had separately received on drug charges. Zara's legacy in Hickory and across Australia has been shaped by a community determined to ensure that her name carries meaning beyond the tragedy of her death. A playground in the Hickory area was dedicated to her memory, giving children a place to play in honor of a child who loved life despite every obstacle placed before her. North Carolina subsequently enacted legislation referred to informally in connection with Zara's case, strengthening the state's approach to child safety reporting and response. The case also led to significant scrutiny of how social services and law enforcement agencies share information about vulnerable children in blended family households. Zara Baker had come to North Carolina from another country, which meant that the network of people who might have known her circumstances best, family friends, her school community in Australia, extended relatives, were thousands of miles away and had no visibility into what her daily life in Hickory actually looked like. The investigators who worked Zara's case have spoken over the years about the complexity of piecing together a case from scattered physical evidence, when no single location tells the full story, and when the primary suspect had gone to considerable lengths to prevent the truth from emerging. Detective work in cases like Zara's requires patience, forensic precision, and an unwillingness to accept the first and most convenient explanation. In Zara's case, the ransom note that Elisa had planted very nearly succeeded in sending investigators in an entirely wrong direction. It was the combination of cell phone data, forensic discoveries, and the eventual unraveling of Elisa's account under questioning that brought the truth to the surface. Elisa Baker remains in federal custody as of the time of this video, serving out the drug sentence that begins where her state murder sentence ended. Zara Baker, the girl from Australia who survived cancer and the loss of her leg and the loss of her hearing and came to North Carolina looking for a family that would love her, deserved so much better than what she found. Number 3. Renee King, the woman who was trusted with a 2-year-old and chose cruelty. Lily Lynette Furneaux Wolfenbarger was 2 years old. She had a mother, Lauren Furneaux, who loved her deeply and who had shared custody of Lily with Lily's father, Jeff Wolfenbarger. Jeff lived in a mobile home in New Haven, a small community in Macomb County in the southeastern part of Michigan, and he shared that home with his wife, a 30-year-old woman named Renee Marie King. On November 20, 2010, Lauren Furneaux brought Lily to that mobile home to spend time with her father, a routine part of the custody arrangement the two parents had established. Lauren never saw her daughter alive again. By the time she was contacted that evening, Lily was gone. The circumstances of Lily's death, as they emerged through the investigation that followed, were among the most disturbing that Macomb County prosecutors had encountered in years. Renee King had married Jeff Wolfenbarger and taken on the role of stepmother to Lily, a toddler who was, by all accounts, a typical 2-year-old in every way, prone to the tantrums and the occasional toilet training accident and the moments of frustration that are entirely normal and expected at that developmental stage. What should have been met with patience and the ordinary guidance that children require was instead met, prosecutors alleged, with a response so disproportionate and so dangerous that it ended Lily's life on the day she had come to visit her father. Investigators determined that Jeff Wolfenbarger was not present in the home during the period when Lily was harmed. Renee King and Lily were alone together. The medical examiner who examined Lily following her death was Dr. Daniel Spitz of the Macomb County Medical Examiner's Office, who testified in detail about the findings of his examination. According to Dr. Spitz's testimony, Lily had sustained at least 20 distinct areas of impact to her head, as well as a vaginal injury. The cause of death was determined to be multiple blunt force injuries. When questioned by investigators, Renee King provided an explanation that she maintained throughout the investigation and into trial. She claimed that Lily's head injuries had been caused by 2 separate accidental falls, that the child had slipped and fallen in a manner that produced the injuries documented by the medical examiner. She denied any knowledge of the vaginal injury and denied having done anything to harm Lily. Her defense attorneys, led by Jason Malkiewicz, argued at trial that Lily's death was a tragic accident and that Renee was innocent of the charges against her. Malkiewicz told jurors that Lily had a pre-existing medical condition and that the physical evidence was consistent with accidental harm rather than intentional action. Prosecutors presented a very different account. They argued that Renee King had harmed Lily in response to the child's behavior, her tantrums and toilet training accidents, and that the nature, number, and distribution of Lily's injuries were entirely inconsistent with accidental falls. They called medical experts who testified that the injuries Lily had sustained could not have been produced by the falls Renee had described, and that the pattern and severity of the harm done to Lily pointed toward deliberate action by an adult. Prosecutors also introduced evidence about the dynamics of the household and about the relationship between Renee and the child in her care. Lily's mother, Lauren Furneaux, testified about her concerns regarding Lily's safety in the time leading up to November 20th, 2010. She described having documented bruises and injuries on Lily during the periods when the child had been in Renee and Jeff's care, and explained that she had attempted to use this documentation in a bid for full custody. She told prosecutors and the court that her concerns had not been sufficient to change the custody arrangement before the day that ended Lily's life. The trial proceeded in Macomb County Circuit Court, and the jury deliberated for approximately 2 hours before returning a verdict. On February 27, 2012, Renee Marie King was convicted on all 3 counts she faced: felony murder, first-degree child abuse, and criminal sexual conduct. The speed of the jury's deliberation, just 2 hours to evaluate the evidence in a capital case, was remarkable and signaled the clarity with which the jury had assessed the testimony and physical evidence presented to them. Defense attorney Malkiewicz expressed shock at the pace of the verdict and maintained that his client was innocent. Renee King covered her face with her hands when the verdicts were announced, one of the only visible emotional responses she displayed throughout the proceedings. On April 10, 2012, Renee King appeared in Macomb County Circuit Court for sentencing. The first-degree felony murder conviction carried an automatic, mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole under Michigan law. There was no discretion for the judge to exercise on that count. The judge imposed that mandatory sentence and then added consecutive terms for the child abuse and criminal sexual conduct convictions. The sentencing hearing included testimony from Lauren Furneaux, who told the court she would never see Lily's first day of school, never see Lily grow up, never be there for the milestones that define a child's life. Her statement was directed at both the court and at Renee King, who sat in the courtroom as these words were delivered. Lauren made clear that she believed the system had failed Lily by not acting on the concerns she had raised before November 20th, 2010, and that she hoped other parents in similar situations would be heard before another child was placed in danger. The case of Lily Wolfenbarger Furneaux prompted significant reflection in Macomb County about the adequacy of child protective responses to parental concerns raised during custody disputes. Lily's mother had documented injuries on her daughter and had flagged her worries through appropriate channels, and yet those concerns had not been sufficient to trigger an intervention that might have changed the outcome. This tension between the legal presumption that both parents in a custody arrangement have equal rights and standing, and the reality that documented harm to a child requires a swifter protective response, is one that family law advocates, child safety professionals, and legislators have grappled with in the years since Lily's death. The case serves as a painful illustration of the gap that can exist between the warning signs that are visible in a situation and the institutional response those warning signs actually generate. Renee Marie King remains in the Michigan correctional system, serving a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. There has been no successful appeal or legal challenge to her conviction. Jeff Wolfenbarger, Lily's father, was charged separately with negligent homicide, but those charges were ultimately dropped. The circumstances that led to Lily being placed in a position of vulnerability on November 20th, 2010, remain a source of grief and reflection for everyone who followed the case. Lily Wolfenbarger Furno was 2 years old. She should have been protected. Number 4. Monique Osuna, who transformed a little boy's rescue into a second nightmare. Emric Osuna arrived in Meridian, Idaho, in February 2018, in circumstances that already carried within them a deep and painful story. The 9-year-old had been sent to live with his biological father, Eric Emmanuel Osuna, and Eric's wife, Monique Osuna, after his biological mother, Cecile Siglali Lucero, was convicted in California of severely harming Emric's infant twin siblings. In a bitter irony that investigators and prosecutors would later note with profound sadness, Emric had been removed from one harmful situation and placed, without adequate safeguards, into another. He arrived in Idaho having already experienced loss and instability, and he came into the care of a woman who, as would become horrifyingly clear over time, had no intention of treating him as a child worthy of love, care, or basic human dignity. Monique Osuna was 29 years old when Emric came to live in the apartment she shared with Eric Osuna in Meridian. The family also included other children, and investigators would later find evidence suggesting that some of Emric's siblings endured difficult conditions as well, though it was Emric who bore the full and devastating weight of Monique's behavior. From early in his time in Idaho, Emric was subjected to a pattern of treatment that included severe restrictions on food, prolonged physical exercise as punishment, confinement in a closet without bedding, verbal and emotional degradation, and physical discipline that went far beyond anything that could be justified or rationalized under any standard. Monique Osuna later admitted in her written confession and in court proceedings that she had never wanted Emric, that she had viewed him as an inconvenience to the family, and that her discipline of him had escalated over time to a degree that she herself acknowledged was wrong. The Osuna home had a nanny camera system installed within the apartment, and it was that camera system that ultimately provided investigators with an unprecedented and devastating record of what Emric's daily life in Meridian actually looked like. When Ada County law enforcement entered the apartment following Emric's death and secured the camera footage, they found weeks of recordings that documented the reality of what this child had been enduring. Prosecutors played nearly 20 clips from those recordings during Monique's sentencing hearing, and witnesses in the courtroom sat through close to an hour of footage that left the room in silence. The recordings showed Emric being subjected to hours of forced physical exercise, including sessions that began in the early hours of the morning. They showed him being yelled at, degraded, and treated in ways that made clear he occupied a fundamentally different and far lesser place within that household than any other member of the family. Among the moments that stayed with Meridian Police Detective Eric Stoffel long after the investigation concluded was a sequence captured on the nanny camera during one of the middle-of-the-night exercise sessions. In the footage, Emric, exhausted and in distress, stopped what he was doing and began speaking to God. He cried and asked, through his tears, why what was happening to him was happening. Detective Stoffel, testifying at the sentencing hearing, said that as Emmerich spoke those words, he could see Monique Osuna in the background, hidden from the child's view, listening. It was one of the most affecting moments of his entire investigative career. Emmerich was talking to God, because there was no human being in that home who would listen. On the morning of September 1st, 2020, Eric Osuna sent his wife a text message suggesting they take Emmerich to the emergency room because the boy was unwell. Monique and Eric did not act on that. Instead, they called a friend to come to the apartment. When Emmerich became unresponsive, they attempted to give him Pedialyte rather than contacting emergency services. By the time anyone called 911, it was too late. Emmerich was transported to St. Luke's Children's Hospital in downtown Boise, where he died on September 2nd, 2020. He was 9 years old. He weighed 44 pounds at the time of his death. That figure, 44 pounds for a 9-year-old, became one of the most cited facts in news coverage of the case because it conveyed so starkly and so simply the physical condition to which Emmerich had been reduced by the time he left that apartment for the last time. Both Monique and Eric Osuna were charged with first-degree murder. Both entered guilty pleas as part of agreements that removed the death penalty from consideration. Monique pleaded guilty in February 2022, and Eric pleaded guilty in March 2022. The sentencing hearing for Monique Osuna took place on June 9, 2022, before Ada County District Judge Stephen Hippler, and lasted more than 5 hours. Ada County Prosecutor John Dinger told the court in his closing statement that a small child had been sent to Idaho to be cared for by the defendants, and that instead he had been sent to a living hell. Monique Osuna made a brief statement through tears, acknowledging that what she had done was wrong and that she could not bring Emmerich back or undo her actions. She said that her discipline of him had escalated, using a word, escalated, that prosecutors noted failed to capture the full reality of what the camera footage had actually shown. Judge Hippler sentenced Monique Osuna to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In delivering the sentence, he described her actions as sadistic, evil, and heartless, and stated that Emmerich had not been part of the family in any meaningful sense, that he had not been loved, that he had been viewed as an inconvenience, and that in the end, his body had wasted away as a direct result of what Monique had done to him. The court also imposed a 100-year no-contact order with respect to the surviving children who had witnessed Emmerich's treatment within that apartment. Eric Osuna was subsequently sentenced as well, receiving a significant prison term for his role in facilitating the abuse through his inaction and his refusal to seek help for his son. The case of Emmerich Osuna prompted immediate and widespread reflection on the systemic failures that had allowed a child already identified as vulnerable, a child removed from one harmful home, to be placed in another without adequate monitoring or follow-through. Child welfare advocates, legislators, and professionals in the field of child protection pointed to the gap in oversight that existed between the California case that had removed Emmerich from his biological mother and the Idaho household where he came to live. There was no robust mechanism in place to ensure that the people taking custody of Emmerich were capable of providing the safe and stable environment he needed and deserved. The nanny camera footage that documented his final months in the Osuna home became a powerful and terrible argument for stronger child welfare monitoring of children transferred across state lines following parental abuse findings. Emmerich Osuna deserved to be one of the lucky ones, a child who escaped a dangerous situation and found safety on the other side. He was not. He was 9 years old, and he weighed 44 pounds, and he talked to God because no one else was listening. Number 5. Angela Polina, the woman who turned a home into a place of punishment for a little boy with autism. Thomas Valva was 8 years old, and he had autism. He was a third grader at East Moriches Elementary School in the Center Moriches community on Long Island, New York. And by all accounts, he was a child who brought warmth into the lives of his teachers and classmates despite the challenges his diagnosis presented. Thomas lived with his father, Michael Valva, a man who had worked with the New York City Police Department since 2005, and with Michael's fiancée, Angela Polina, 45, who had moved into the family's home on Bittersweet Lane in Center Moriches, along with her own 3 daughters. When Michael Valva's 3 sons, Thomas and his brothers, including 10-year-old Anthony, moved into that home after their biological mother lost custody, it marked the beginning of what prosecutors would later describe in court as a period of systematic and sustained mistreatment directed primarily at Thomas and Anthony, driven largely by Angela Polina. The home on Bittersweet Lane had 4 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. Thomas and Anthony were not permitted to sleep in them. According to the evidence presented at trial, Polina and Michael Valva imposed a regime within the household that confined the 2 boys to the unheated garage that was attached to the home, particularly as a form of punishment. In the winter months on Long Island, temperatures in that garage dropped to levels that were dangerous for anyone left there for extended periods without adequate clothing, warmth, or shelter. Prosecutors presented evidence that the boys were denied access to the house for basic necessities, that they were washed with cold water from a hose in the backyard rather than being permitted to bathe inside, and that the level of punishment and deprivation they experienced was the product of a deliberate and ongoing pattern of behavior rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. Prosecutors argued at trial that Angela Polina was the driving force behind the treatment of Thomas and Anthony within the household, that she ran the home with what one prosecutor described as an iron fist, and that her control over the domestic environment shaped every aspect of the boys' daily experience. She was characterized by the prosecution as someone who had decided, at a fundamental level, that Thomas and Anthony were not children she intended to care for with any degree of warmth or compassion, and that their father's willingness to defer to her on matters of household management created the conditions in which their mistreatment could continue without effective challenge or intervention. On the night of January 16, 2020, temperatures on Long Island dropped to approximately 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas and Anthony were in the garage. In the early morning hours of January 17, 2020, Suffolk County police officers responded to the Bittersweet Lane home at approximately 9:40 a.m. after Michael Valva called to report that Thomas had been found unresponsive. The initial account Valva offered to responding officers, that Thomas had hit his head while walking to the bus stop, was quickly identified as inconsistent with the boy's condition and the evidence at the scene. Thomas was transported to Long Island Community Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The medical examination confirmed that Thomas had died of hypothermia. He had been in the unheated garage overnight in temperatures that fell to 19 degrees, and no one in that house had brought him inside. The investigation that followed involved a detailed review of the household's history, the experiences of both Thomas and Anthony within the home, communications between Polina and Valva, and the broader pattern of behavior that had preceded Thomas's death. Law enforcement and child welfare investigators spoke with the boy's biological mother, Justina Zubko Valva, who had been fighting to alert authorities to her concerns about her son's welfare and had been largely unsuccessful in prompting an effective intervention prior to Thomas's death. The case raised immediate and urgent questions about how the warning signs that had been visible to those who interacted with Thomas and Anthony, his teachers, school administrators, his biological mother, had failed to generate a protective response before it was too late. Both Michael Valva and Angela Polina were charged with second-degree murder. Michael Valva was tried first. On November 4, 2022, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and 4 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Angela Polina's trial began in early 2023 before Suffolk Supreme Court Justice Timothy Mazzei. The prosecution presented the full scope of the evidence about conditions in the home, including footage that showed Thomas shivering and the deprivation the boys had endured, and built a case around Polina's role as the primary architect of the household's treatment of the children. Her defense argued that Michael Valva bore sole responsibility for Thomas's death, and that Polina had been a secondary figure in the household dynamics, rather than the driving force prosecutors portrayed her as. Polina chose to testify in her own defense during the trial. That decision proved consequential. During her testimony, she acknowledged that some of her actions toward Thomas and Anthony had been what she herself described as evil, but attempted to place the primary responsibility on Michael Valva. Prosecutors argued that her testimony demonstrated not remorse, but an attempt to shift blame, and that the evidence of her central role in managing the household and directing the treatment of the boys was inconsistent with the picture she tried to paint of herself as a lesser participant. On March 10, 2023, the jury found Angela Polina guilty on all counts: second-degree murder and 4 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. The jury reached its unanimous verdict after a trial that had lasted several weeks. At sentencing, on April 11, 2023, the courtroom was filled with Thomas's teachers, family members, and several of the jurors who had sat through the trial. Prosecutors stood before Judge Mazzei and asked for the maximum sentence available, noting that Polina had never expressed any genuine remorse for what had happened to Thomas, that she had not offered so much as a word of apology to the memory of the 8-year-old boy who had lived in her home for 2 years and died in her garage. Thomas's biological mother, Justina Zubko Valva, attended the sentencing and listened as prosecutors honored Thomas's memory. Judge Mazzei sentenced Angela Polina to 25 years to life in prison, the maximum available sentence. He made a remark during sentencing that received widespread attention. He stated that his only regret was that there was no unheated garage in the prison where Polina would be spending the rest of her years, with no mattress and no blankets, as Thomas and Anthony had been made to endure. The courtroom erupted in response to the sentence and the judge's words. Polina was taken away in handcuffs. The Thomas Valva case prompted an immediate legislative and systemic response in New York. The failure of the child welfare system to act on the concerns raised by Justina Zubko Valva, who had repeatedly attempted to alert authorities to what was happening to her sons, became the focus of significant public debate and policy review. The case demonstrated with painful clarity that having a parent who is actively trying to protect a child is not sufficient on its own to generate a protective response if the institutional systems that are supposed to intervene do not function effectively. Thomas Valva was 8 years old, and he had autism, and he trusted the adults in his world to keep him safe, as every child must. He deserved that safety. Angela Polina and Michael Valva were the 2 people most responsible for ensuring it, and they failed him in every possible way. Number 6. Shamdai Arjun, the stepmother who took everything from a 9-year-old who had only just arrived. Ashdeep Kaur had been in the United States for 3 months. She was 9 years old, and she had traveled from India to be with her father, Sukhjinder Singh, who was living in a shared apartment in the Richmond Hill neighborhood of Queens, New York. Sukhjinder worked at a local restaurant and was in a relationship with a woman named Shamdai Arjun, who was in her mid-50s and who had come to share the apartment with Sukhjinder. The apartment was also home to another family, and the tight quarters of that living arrangement meant that other adults in the building were in proximity to the daily life of the household. Ashdeep had come to America to be part of her father's life. Family members who had known her in India and who were aware of the household she was entering had expressed concerns about her welfare in the months before her death, noting that Ashdeep herself had told relatives about mistreatment she was experiencing at the hands of Shamdai Arjun. Those concerns did not reach the level of a formal intervention before August 19, 2016. On the evening of August 19, 2016, at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, a neighbor and fellow resident of the apartment observed Shamdai Arjun leaving the building with her former husband, Raymond Narayan, and with 2 young grandchildren, ages 3 and 5. When the neighbor asked about Ashdeep, inquiring as to the 9-year-old's whereabouts, Shamdai told her that the child was in the bathroom and was waiting for her father to come and pick her up. The neighbor accepted this explanation, but over the next several hours, she noticed that the bathroom light in the apartment had remained on continuously. Growing concerned, she eventually contacted Sukhjinder Singh and reported what she had observed. Sukhjinder instructed her to break through the bathroom door. What the neighbor found when she broke through that door was Ashdeep Kaur's lifeless body in the bathtub. The child was unresponsive and showed clear signs of injury. Emergency services were contacted, but Ashdeep could not be revived. Sukhjinder Singh, upon arriving at the apartment, was so overcome with grief that he fainted at the scene. Investigators from the Queen's Police immediately secured the apartment and began building a picture of what had occurred. The medical examiner's office conducted an examination and determined that Ashdeep's cause of death was manual strangulation, that someone had used their hands to take the child's life. The examination also revealed bruising on Ashdeep's body, consistent with prior physical mistreatment. Law enforcement moved quickly. Shamdai Arjun had left the building before the body was discovered, and investigators tracked her movements through the evening. She was located at the home of her former husband, Raymond Narayan, where she had gone after leaving the apartment. She was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder. Raymond Narayan was subsequently charged with obstruction of justice for having driven Shamdai away from the scene and provided her a location to go after the killing. Acting Queen's District Attorney John Ryan issued a statement at the time of Arjun's arrest describing the case as horrifying and stating that a defenseless 9-year-old child who had been placed in the care of her stepmother had instead been taken from the world by that same woman. Shamdai Arjun went to trial in Queen's Supreme Court in May 2019 before Justice Kenneth Holder. The prosecution presented testimony from the neighbor who had discovered Ashdeep's body, from forensic experts who testified about the cause and manner of death, and from family members who spoke about the concerns that had been raised about Ashdeep's treatment prior to her death. The medical examiner's findings were central to the case. The determination that Ashdeep had died of manual strangulation, combined with the evidence that Shamdai had been the last adult with the child before she fled the apartment, formed the core of the prosecution's argument. The defense contended that the evidence was insufficient to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Shamdai was responsible, but the jury was not persuaded. Deliberations lasted less than 1 hour. In a trial that had taken days to present, the jury took under 60 minutes to reach a unanimous verdict, finding Shamdai Arjun guilty of second-degree murder. The speed of that verdict was as striking as the swiftness with which the jury in the Renee King case had reached its conclusion, and it reflected the clarity of the evidence presented. Shamdai Arjun showed no outward reaction as the verdict was read. She maintained her innocence through her attorney, who stated that when the evidence was evaluated properly, it would not support a conclusion of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury disagreed emphatically. On June 3, 2019, Justice Kenneth Holder sentenced Shamdai Arjun to 22 years to life in prison for the second-degree murder of Ashdeep Kaur. In delivering the sentence, Judge Holder addressed Arjun directly, describing the case as a disturbing example of extreme violence and suffering. He told her that it was deeply troubling to consider what Ashdeep had endured in her final moments, and that the child had looked up into the face of the woman who was supposed to protect her as her life was taken. The acting Queen's District Attorney issued a statement noting that the sentence would likely guarantee that Shamdai Arjun would never see freedom again, and that it was more than warranted given the nature of the crime. The case of Ashdeep Kaur raised questions that extended beyond the individual tragedy of her death. She had traveled from India as a 9-year-old to join her father, entering a household in a foreign country where she knew no one, could access no independent support network, and was entirely dependent on the adults around her for her physical safety and emotional well-being. The concerns that family members had raised about her welfare, concerns that Ashdeep herself had apparently articulated to relatives, had not been sufficient to trigger any formal check on her circumstances before the night of August 19, 2016. For immigrant children placed in the households of parents and step-parents in the United States, the absence of a domestic support network and the difficulties of communicating concerns across international boundaries can create conditions of particular vulnerability. Ashdeep Kaur had been in America for 3 months. She was 9 years old. She never got to know what her life here might have been. Number 7. Nicole Scott, who turned her stepson's final years into a slow and deliberate disappearance. Gavin Peterson was 12 years old when he died on July 9, 2024, in a home in West Haven, Utah. But the circumstances that led to his death had been building for years. Prosecutors estimated that Gavin had been subjected to systematic mistreatment for approximately 5 years before the day that Weber County Sheriff's Office deputies responded to the home and found him unresponsive. The people responsible for that mistreatment were his father, Shane Jesse Peterson, his stepmother, Nicole Leah Scott, and his older brother Tyler Shane Peterson, all of whom were ultimately charged in connection with Gavin's death. It was Nicole Scott, however, whom the judge presiding over the case identified as the primary architect of what happened to Gavin, a characterization she used repeatedly during sentencing proceedings. Nicole Scott was 50 years old at the time of her guilty plea in April 2025. Her relationship with Gavin's father Shane had brought her into the role of stepmother to Gavin, and the picture that investigators assembled through the evidence they gathered was one of a woman who had decided, early and firmly, that Gavin was unwelcome in the household she controlled. Text messages recovered during the investigation revealed the depth of her hostility toward the boy. In one exchange with Shane Peterson, Scott expressed intense frustration about a school nurse reporting Gavin's infected fingers, writing about how the situation made her despise Gavin more and more. Gavin was 11 years old at the time those messages were sent. Within weeks of that exchange, Nicole and Shane made the decision to remove Gavin from school entirely. In May of 2023, cutting off his access to the one environment outside the home where adults had been observing him and raising concerns about his condition. Gavin had been attending school, and school personnel had been documenting what they saw. Teachers and staff had noticed clear signs of malnutrition and had filed reports with Utah's Division of Child and Family Services. One of the most telling observations made by school staff was that Gavin was repeatedly taking food, and the reason he was doing so was straightforward. He was not being adequately fed at home. When Nicole and Shane learned that school reports were being made to Child Protective Services, they withdrew Gavin from school and, according to prosecutors, did not provide him with any alternative form of education. From that point on, Gavin was confined to the home, isolated from anyone outside the household who might have seen his condition and intervened. The conditions within that home, as investigators documented them and as prosecutors presented them in court, were extreme. Gavin was confined to a single room. He had no bed and no mattress. He was denied adequate food and water. He was given items like mustard sandwiches rather than regular meals. He was forced to sleep on the floor. He was kept naked and confined to a taped-off square within the room. He was placed under 24-hour surveillance through cameras that tracked his movements. Prosecutors stated that he had become so malnourished by the time of his death that his body had deteriorated to a degree that was documented in the autopsy photographs presented to the court. During sentencing proceedings, the judge noted that the only historical comparison she could think of that came close to describing what Gavin had experienced was the conditions of a concentration camp. The isolation, the dehumanization, the deliberate deprivation of basic human necessities. On July 9, 2024, Gavin fell in the bathtub of the home. Rather than calling for emergency assistance immediately, Nicole Scott and Tyler Peterson spent approximately 20 minutes concealing surveillance cameras and removing evidence before contacting anyone. When emergency services were finally called, responders found Gavin unresponsive. He died that day at a hospital, the formal cause of death recorded as sepsis, the result of the severe physical deterioration his body had undergone over the preceding period. He was 12 years old. Nicole Scott, Shane Peterson, and Tyler Peterson were all arrested and charged. Shane Peterson pleaded guilty in March 2025 and received a sentence of up to life in prison. Nicole Scott entered her guilty plea on April 17, 2025, admitting to first-degree murder, 3 counts of aggravated child abuse, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and a controlled substance charge. Sentencing was held on May 12, 2025, before 2nd District Court Judge Camille L. Nider in Ogden, Utah. The sentencing hearing was lengthy and deeply emotional. Prosecutors presented the full scope of the evidence, read the text messages in which Scott had expressed her contempt for Gavin, and asked the court to impose the maximum sentence on every count. The state's attorney described Scott as the architect of Gavin's destruction and argued that she had orchestrated the conditions of his confinement and deprivation while directing others within the household in their treatment of the boy. Judge Nider sentenced Nicole Scott to 15 years to life for first-degree murder, with additional sentences of 1 to 15 years each on the abuse and obstruction charges, all to run consecutively. She told Scott during sentencing that she did not expect Scott would ever be released from prison, that she hoped she would not be, and that it was entirely fair for Scott to spend the rest of her life behind bars. She addressed Scott directly. "Never again should you have this kind of contact with a child," she said. "Never again should you publicly see the outside of a prison." Nicole Scott wept as the sentence was delivered. She was transferred to the Utah State Correctional Facility on May 21, 2025, to begin serving her sentence. The community in West Haven, Utah, responded to Gavin's death with the kind of grief and outrage that cases involving the prolonged suffering of a child inevitably produce. Multiple reports to Child Protective Services had been filed before Gavin was removed from school. Those reports, and the reports from school staff, had not resulted in an intervention that reached Gavin in time. The question of why, how a child can be the subject of multiple warnings to protective services, can have adults in his school documenting visible signs of malnutrition, can have a biological mother who had been raising concerns, and still end up in a room with no bed and no adequate food while nominally under the supervision of the state, is one that Utah's child welfare system has been forced to confront directly in the aftermath of Gavin's death. His father, his stepmother, and his older brother all played roles in what happened to him, but the systemic failure that allowed it to continue for years is a responsibility that extends further than those 3 individuals. Number 8. Binash Batul, the stepmother who fled to Pakistan and came back to face justice for Sarah. Sarah Sharif was 10 years old when her body was found in her family's home in Woking, a town in Surrey, in the southwest of England, on August 10, 2023. Police in London discovered Sarah's body under a blanket in a bunk bed in the house. She had over 70 documented injuries. The discovery came after Sarah's father, Irfan Sharif, had telephoned UK police from Pakistan, where he had fled with Sarah's stepmother, Binash Batul, and Sarah's uncle, Faisal Malik, and made a statement that would be used against him in court. In that call, Irfan Sharif told police that he had legally punished Sarah and that she had died, and that he had beaten her too much, but had not intended to kill her. Irfan Sharif was 42 years old at the time. Binash Batul was 30. They had been living in the Woking home with Sarah and her siblings, and prosecutors would argue at trial that the 2 of them, along with Sarah's uncle Faisal Malik, had subjected Sarah to a sustained campaign of serious and repeated abuse over an extended period before her death. Sarah's biological mother, Olga Sharif, had previously raised concerns about the treatment of her children while in Irfan's care, and accusations of physical abuse had been made to authorities. Those accusations had not been fully addressed before Sarah's death. Child Services had investigated following a report from Sarah's school that she had appeared with bruises, but no further action had been taken at that stage. Irfan Sharif had subsequently removed Sarah from school, a step that cut her off from the institutional monitoring that might have identified the full extent of what she was enduring. The three individuals, Irfan Sharif, Bainosh Batul, and Faisal Malik, fled to Pakistan immediately after Sarah's death in August 2023. Their departure was rapid and deliberate, and it suggested a clear awareness that what had happened to Sarah was not something they could justify or explain within the legal framework of the United Kingdom. They were located in Pakistan and were arrested at London's Gatwick Airport in September 2023, more than a month after Sarah's death, upon returning to Britain. They were immediately taken into custody and charged with murder. The trial was held at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, and it lasted for several weeks. Prosecutor Bill Emlyn Jones told jurors at the outset of the trial that Sarah had suffered a range of injuries including burns, broken bones, and bite marks, evidence of what he described as a campaign of serious and repeated violence perpetrated by those who were supposed to be caring for her. Irfan Sharif, who had initially denied sustained abuse in his testimony, later acknowledged under cross-examination from Bainosh Batul's defense attorney that he took full responsibility for Sarah's death, though he maintained that he had not intended to kill her. Both Irfan Sharif and Bainosh Batul were convicted of murder on December 11, 2024. Faisal Malik was found not guilty of murder, but was convicted of the lesser offense of causing or allowing the death of a child. On December 17, 2024, both Irfan Sharif and Bainosh Batul were sentenced to life in prison for Sarah's murder. Faisal Malik received a sentence of 16 years for his role in her death. In a statement read before the court by a prosecutor, Sarah's biological mother, Olga Sharif, called the three individuals cowards, sadists, and executioners. She spoke of her daughter and of the incomprehensibility of the cruelty Sarah had endured at the hands of those who were legally responsible for her well-being. Surrey County Council, the local authority that had received concerns about Sarah's welfare prior to her death, announced plans to conduct a review of the circumstances of the case and of the decisions made by its Child Services Department in the period leading up to August 2023. The review was intended to examine how a child who had been the subject of welfare concerns and school reports had ended up in the conditions that produced the injuries documented at her death. The case of Sarah Sharif generated significant public debate across the United Kingdom about the adequacy of child protection systems, particularly in cases involving families where one parent raises concerns about the other and where the institutional response fails to translate those concerns into timely protective action. It also raised questions about the international dimensions of child welfare, about what happens when a family moves between countries or has ties to jurisdictions outside the UK, and about whether those circumstances affect the speed and comprehensiveness of protective responses. Sarah Sharif's mother had been fighting to protect her daughter within a system that had not given her concerns the weight they deserved. That failure, compounded by the decision to allow Sarah to remain in a household from which she had ultimately been taken out of school and isolated from external scrutiny, is one that the UK child protection community continues to examine. Bainosh Batul was 30 years old when she was convicted of Sarah's murder. She entered the UK justice system as the stepmother of a child she had been entrusted to help raise, and she will spend a minimum of years in prison, the minimum tariff for a life sentence in England and Wales to be determined by the court, before being eligible for parole consideration. The full minimum term was expected to be set in subsequent hearings. Sarah Sharif was 10 years old, and she had a mother who loved her, and she had a life that should have been full of every ordinary experience that children are meant to have. She deserved to be protected by the systems and by the people around her. She was not. Number 9. Cheyenne Elmore, who stood by while a 6-year-old boy was taken from the world. Justin Elmore was 6 years old in August 2025, living with his father, Franklin Elmore Jr., and his stepmother, Cheyenne Elmore, in South Bend, Indiana. By all accounts from those outside the home, Justin was a typical 6-year-old, a small boy, at an age when children are beginning to absorb the world around them, forming friendships, discovering what they enjoy, and relying entirely on the adults in their lives for safety and care. What was happening inside the home on August 3, 2025, was far removed from what any 6-year-old child should ever experience, and the decisions made by Cheyenne Elmore on that day, the decision not to stop what was happening, not to seek help, not to tell the truth to the medical personnel who arrived to try to save Justin's life, placed her at the center of a criminal case that would end with one of the most severe sentences handed down by an Elkhart County court in recent memory. On August 3, 2025, Franklin and Cheyenne Elmore brought Justin to Elkhart General Hospital after stating that the boy had been hitting himself in the head due to behavioral issues and had become unresponsive. Emergency room physicians and trauma surgeons who examined Justin found that his injuries were not consistent with self-inflicted harm. The medical team documented a traumatic brain injury and a punctured lung. Their professional assessment was clear. What they were seeing could not have been caused by a child hitting himself. Law enforcement was notified, and an investigation was immediately opened. Police obtained surveillance video from the home, and what that footage showed was decisive. The video recorded Justin being subjected to physical harm by his father, Franklin Elmore Jr., in the family's playroom, directly contradicting the account both parents had given to medical staff and to investigators. Prosecutors from the Elkhart County Prosecutor's Office built a case that addressed both parents' roles in what had happened to Justin. Franklin Elmore Jr. was identified as the person who directly harmed Justin on August 3, 2025. The investigation also established a broader pattern of behavior within the home, including evidence that Justin had been forced to run while carrying weights, that he had been confined to a room monitored by cameras, and that he had been subjected to physical discipline that went far beyond what any understanding of reasonable parental authority could accommodate. Cheyenne Elmore, while not identified as the person who directly harmed Justin on the day he died, was charged on the basis of her actions surrounding the incident. Her failure to intervene, her concealment of the truth from hospital staff, her deletion of evidence, and her encouragement of Franklin not to cooperate with investigators. Prosecutors argued that without Cheyenne's active participation in the cover-up, the truth of what had happened to Justin might have emerged in time to hold the perpetrators fully accountable through the normal course of investigation. Franklin Elmore Jr. entered a guilty plea and was sentenced in November 2025 to 65 years in prison for Justin's murder. Cheyenne Elmore entered her own guilty plea to aiding, inducing, or causing murder. Her sentencing was held on March 10, 2026, before Elkhart County Circuit Court Judge Michael Cristofino. During the sentencing hearing, the judge stated that the case was one of the most tragic murders he had been involved with in his 45-year career as both a lawyer and a judge. Cheyenne Elmore addressed the court during the hearing and expressed what she described as genuine regret, stating that she wished she could go back further than August 3, that she wished she had pushed her husband to get Justin help, or to allow Justin to spend time with his biological mother, and that perhaps, if she had done those things, the tragedy would not have occurred. Prosecutor Vicki Becker acknowledged that Cheyenne had accepted responsibility, but also noted that she had lied to medical personnel, had deleted evidence, and had encouraged her husband not to speak with investigators, actions that the court considered in assessing her culpability and the appropriate sentence. Judge Cristofino sentenced Cheyenne Elmore to 65 years in prison, with 60 years to be served in the Indiana Department of Correction and 5 years suspended to be served on probation following release. The sentence matched the 65 years Franklin Elmore Jr. had received, a fact that the judge indicated reflected the gravity of Cheyenne's role in the events surrounding Justin's death, even if she had not been the person who directly harmed him. Cheyenne Elmore filed a notice of appeal on April 9, 2026, initiating a review of her sentence by the Indiana Court of Appeals. The appellate process will require the preparation of legal briefs and a formal review by the appeals court, which has the authority to uphold the sentence, reduce it, or send the matter back to the trial court for a new sentencing hearing. As of the time of this video, that appeal remains pending. Justin Elmore was 6 years old. The surveillance footage that captured the final moments of his life inside that South Bend home, and the evidence gathered by investigators of the conditions in which he had been living, painted a picture of a child who had been in danger long before August 3, 2025. Elkhart County Prosecutor Vicki Becker, in her remarks at sentencing, made clear that the responsibility for Justin's death rested with both of the adults who had been charged in connection with it. A 6-year-old child's life ended because the adults who were supposed to protect him did not. Number 10. Emma Tustin, the stepmother who silenced the voice of 6-year-old Arthur. Arthur Labinjo-Hughes was 6 years old, and he liked to tell people that he loved them. Those who knew Arthur described a child of extraordinary warmth and expressiveness, a little boy who wore his heart openly and who reached out to the adults in his life with an affection that made the events of his final months all the more difficult to comprehend. Arthur had come to live with his father, Thomas Hughes, and Thomas's girlfriend, Emma Tustin, in the Solihull area of the West Midlands in England, during the period of lockdown restrictions in the spring and summer of 2020, following the death of his mother. He was placed in the care of 2 adults who, prosecutors would later argue, subjected him to a sustained and escalating pattern of mistreatment that lasted for months and that ended on June 16, 2020, when Arthur was found unresponsive at the home he shared with them. Emma Tustin was 32 years old. She was not Arthur's biological mother. She was Thomas Hughes's girlfriend, functioning in the role of a step-parent figure during the period when Arthur came to live in the household. Prosecutors argued at trial that Tustin had been the primary perpetrator of the harm done to Arthur, and that Thomas Hughes had encouraged and facilitated her behavior rather than intervening to protect his son. Arthur had been isolated from his wider family network and from the broader world during the lockdown period, which meant that the adults outside the home, who might otherwise have had regular contact with him and who might have noticed warning signs, were largely cut off from direct observation of his circumstances. The investigation that followed Arthur's death on June 17, 2020, he was taken to hospital on the 16th and died the following day, revealed the full extent of what had been occurring within the home. Medical examination established that Arthur had sustained a head injury comparable in severity to those seen in high-impact accidents, along with evidence of prior harm to his body. Investigators recovered significant evidence, including recordings made within the home that captured Arthur's voice and gave an indication of what his daily life had been like in the weeks and months before his death. Among the most devastating pieces of evidence presented at trial was a series of audio recordings in which Arthur could be heard, in a child's voice, expressing his hunger. He repeatedly told the adults in the home that he was hungry and had not eaten. The jury heard those recordings during the trial, and they became one of the most widely cited and deeply affecting aspects of the case in public reporting and subsequent discussion. Investigators also recovered messages exchanged between Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes, which prosecutors argued demonstrated that both were aware of what was happening to Arthur, and that the treatment he received was deliberate rather than the result of neglect or inattention. Those messages captured the communication between 2 adults who were, in the prosecution's view, jointly engaged in subjecting Arthur to a pattern of treatment that was incompatible with his survival. Social services had been in contact with the household prior to Arthur's death. Concerns had been raised. The extent to which those concerns had been adequately followed up, and the degree to which the lockdown conditions of 2020 had affected social workers' ability to conduct direct in-person assessments of Arthur's welfare, became central questions in the public inquiry and review that followed the case. Emma Tustin was tried at Coventry Crown Court. The trial lasted 8 weeks and included testimony from medical experts, forensic witnesses, digital evidence analysts, and others who had knowledge of Arthur's circumstances and the events of his final months. Tustin had previously pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child cruelty, but contested the murder charge. The prosecution argued that she had administered a fatal injury to Arthur on June 16, 2020, and that her pattern of prior cruelty toward him established the context in which that act took place. The defense contended that the fatal injury to Arthur was not deliberately inflicted by Tustin, and that the murder charge had not been proved to the standard required. Thomas Hughes was tried alongside Tustin for a period of the proceedings on a charge that he had deliberately encouraged Tustin to use physical force on Arthur. On December 2, 2021, the jury convicted Emma Tustin of Arthur's murder. Thomas Hughes was found not guilty of murder, but was convicted of manslaughter. The jury accepted that he had not intended for Arthur to die, but had been culpable in the circumstances of his death, having encouraged the behavior that led to it. On December 3, 2021, Tustin was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years before she would be eligible for parole consideration. Thomas Hughes was sentenced to 21 years in prison for manslaughter. The sentences were among the most significant handed down by a UK court in a child death case in the period covered by this video. The public reaction to Arthur Labinjo-Hughes's case in the United Kingdom was profound and lasting. The audio recordings in which Arthur could be heard saying he was hungry and had not eaten were broadcast widely in media coverage of the trial, and they produced a level of public grief and outrage that translated directly into political pressure on the government to act. A national review of child safeguarding practices, specifically examining the ways in which the lockdown conditions of 2020 had affected the ability of social services and schools to maintain adequate oversight of vulnerable children, was commissioned in the aftermath of Arthur's death. The review produced a series of recommendations aimed at strengthening the systems designed to protect children who are at risk within their own households. Arthur Labinjo-Hughes had told people he loved them. He had been a child who reached out with warmth, even as the world around him contracted. The lockdown that isolated him from the wider network of adults who might have seen what was happening to him, combined with the behavior of the two adults who were responsible for his care, created the conditions in which his death became possible. Emma Tustin will serve a minimum of 29 years in prison before she can apply for parole. Thomas Hughes will serve 21 years. Arthur's wider family, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, the people who loved him and who were separated from him during the months of his greatest vulnerability, have spoken publicly about the loss they carry and about their determination to ensure that Arthur's name is remembered, not only for the manner of his death, but for the warmth and the love that defined his 6 years of life. He told people he loved them. He deserved to be loved in return.